On September 3rd, 1978, at approximately 11:23 p.m., Barbara Holloway opened a locked metal cabinet in her basement that would reveal her husband had been living a lie for their entire marriage. She was 39 years old. Inside that cabinet, wrapped in canvas and connected to a homemade antenna running through a Soviet-manufactured shortwave radio transmitter, model R354, serial number partially filed off, surrounded by encryption pads, frequency schedules written in Cyrillic, and a logbook documenting transmissions dating back to 1969, the year they got married. By dawn, she would understand that the man she had shared a bed with for 9 years was not Thomas Holloway, aerospace in Milwaukee, but someone else entirely, and that every moment of their life together had been part of an operational cover that was now unraveling. The rain had begun at 6:47 p.m. that Sunday evening in Pasadena, California. By 10:52 p.m., water was seeping through a foundation crack in the basement, 3 inches deep and spreading across the uneven concrete floor. Barbara heard it from upstairs, a sound like footsteps in standing water. Thomas had been in Seattle since Thursday owing aerospace. She was alone. She descended the wooden stairs, turned on the overhead bulb, and surveyed the flooding. She needed to find the main water shutoff valve, but in 9 years of marriage, Thomas had handled all maintenance, all repairs, all interactions with the house's infrastructure. Barbara had never needed to access. She moved through the basement, canvas shoes soaking through, checking behind the nothing. Then she noticed the metal cabinet near Thomas's partition, gray-painted metal, approximately 4 feet tall, secured with a heavy padlock. She had no memory of it ever being opened, no memory of Thomas ever mentioning it, and something about its locked silence, its placement in the corner shadows, struck her as fundamentally wrong. The bolt cutters were in the garage. She retrieved them at 11:19 p.m. as Put returned and positioned the cutting jaws around the padlock's shackle. The metal resisted, then gave with a sharp crack. The lock fell into. Barbara pulled the cabinet door open at exactly 11:23. The transmitter sat on the middle shelf, wrapped loosely in canvas tarp that she didn't recognize. She saw only a metal device approximately 18 inches wide, with dials marked in vacuum tubes visible through ventilation slots, and a thick cable running upward. The model designation was stamped on a metal plate, R350. The serial number beneath had been partially filed away. Surrounding it were spiral-bound notebooks covered in frequency notations and timestamps, a stack of thin paper sheets, each approximately 4 inches square, covered in 5-digit number groups arranged in columns, more Cyrillic text, a black leather logbook with dates in silver ink, pencils, a small flashlight, a mechanical wristwatch showing Moscow time, stopped at 3:17, and antenna cables with professional grade. Barbara lifted the logbook with both hands. The leather was cold, damp. She opened to the first page. The date at the top in Thomas's precise handwriting, June 14th, 2 weeks before their wedding. The entries were brief, formatted in columns, date, time, frequency, duration, notation. The notations were coded, abbreviated combinations that meant nothing to her, but the dates meant everything. September 22nd, 1969, a Monday 3 months after the wedding. Thomas had worked late on a Lockheed proposal. November 8th, 1970, a Sunday. He'd needed to finish calculating. March 3rd, 1972, April 17th, 1973, June 29th, 19... Every date corresponded to a night Thomas had sequestered himself downstairs, claiming work obligations that required concentration. Barbara turned pages, her hands beginning to shake. The most recent entry, August 30th, 4 days ago, the night before Thomas left for Seattle. The notation read 2340-07. 8:45, missed Hertz, confirm receipt, proceed phase 7. She reached for one of the encryption pads. The 5-digit number groups were arranged in grids, each sheet marked with a diagonal pencil line. One-time pads, unbreakable without the matching copy. Barbara had cataloged enough books on cryptography, enough technical histories of signals intelligence to recognize what she was holding. The knowledge assembled gradually. The Cyrillic markings, the encryption materials, the frequency schedules, the logbook spanning 9 years, the antenna threaded through the house's structure, the filed serial number, the Moscow time watch, Thomas's locked partition, his late nights, his privacy requirements, his business trips, his access to classified aerospace at Lockheed Martin, his perfect certainty about how their life should. Barbara sat down on the wet concrete, water-soaked. The logbook lay open in her lap. She understood with terrible clarity that her marriage had been something other than a marriage from its inception, that she had been selected for reasons she couldn't yet comprehend, that the life she believed she'd been living had occurred in a different register entirely, one she'd never been permitted to until now. Until the cabinet opened and the secret became visible in harsh basement light, until 9 years of constructed normalcy revealed itself as operational cover, until the man she'd called her husband dissolved into someone else, someone whose real name whose actual history remained locked behind languages she couldn't read, and transmissions she'd never suspected. She sat there surrounded by proof, water rising around her, and knew that by morning everything would be different, that the choice before her was whether to close the cabinet and pretend she'd never looked, or to acknowledge what she'd found and accept that the life she knew had ended the moment the lock broke. Thomas and Barbara Holloway met on November 14, 1968, at the Midwestern Materials Science Conference held at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. She was 29 years old, a research librarian at Northwest Engineering Library, attending to staff the information desk where conference attendees could request technical bibliography. He was presenting a paper during the afternoon session, something titled Thermal Properties in High Stress. He approached her desk at 3 back issue applied metal. Barbara would later recall that, according to Barbara's Thomas Holloway, practical and desirable. Barbara accepted. They married on June 28, 1969, at a small ceremony in Evanston. Barbara's parents attended, along with 3 colleagues from the Northwestern Library. Thomas had no family present. He explained with what seemed like genuine regret that his parents had passed away in a car accident in that he had a sister somewhere in Oregon with whom he'd lost contact and that he preferred to look forward rather than dwell on. Barbara, whose own family was small and in health, understood isolation to Pasadena, the house on Thomas' family structure to anchor them. Neighbors on North Los Robles Avenue, when later interviewed by FBI agents, described the Holloways as quiet, professional, intensely private. Thomas maintained the yard meticulously, kept the house exterior in perfect repair, and exchanged pleasantries during chance encounters, but never initiated social contact. Barbara was seen leaving for work each morning, returning each evening, occasionally visible through on the couch or small garden. They attended no neighborhood gatherings, hosted no dinner parties, and cultivated no close friendships on the street. Barbara's parents died within 6 months of each other in 1975, her father from a heart attack in March, her mother from cancer in September. Thomas accompanied her to both funerals in Ohio, stood beside her during, helped settle the modest estate. With their deaths, Barbara's last family connections dissolved. She was alone except for Thomas, dependent on him in ways that felt both natural and absolute. Thomas claimed his sister had died in 1977, mentioned it briefly one evening, showed no emotion beyond a controlled sadness. No funeral to attend, no estate to settle. The estrangement had been complete, he explained. Barbara didn't question it. Looking back from September 4th, 1978, sitting in her basement surrounded by Barbara would reconstruct these years with terrible clarity. Every detail that had seemed normal revealed itself as constructed, deliberate, designed to isolate and control. The perfectly ordinary life had been perfectly orchestrated, and she had never suspected because suspicion had seemed absurd. Barbara Holloway spent the first hours of September 4th, 1978, sitting on her basement floor in water that had risen to 4 inches to shut off the main valve. By 4:30 a.m., she had moved the transmitter, the logbooks, the encryption pads, and all associated materials upstairs to the kitchen table, where she arranged them under the overhead light with the methodical precision of someone cataloged. Thomas was not scheduled to return from Seattle until September. She had 3 days, possibly 4, to understand what she had discovered before confronting the reality of his return. She began with document. Barbara owned a Pentax Spotmatic camera, purchased in 1975 for a photography at college. She retrieved it from the hallway closet, loaded a fresh roll of Kodak Triac. Each page of the encryption, she shot 3 of what she'd seen. The logbook became her primary focus. Barbara spread it open on the kitchen table and began constructing a timeline, cross-referencing entries against her own desk calendar and appointment book. The pattern emerged with disturbing clarity. Transmissions occurred bi-weekly, sometimes weekly during certain periods, almost always between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. The sessions lasted between 20 and 45 minutes according to the duration notations, and the frequency of transmissions increased significantly in the 2 weeks preceding Thomas's business trips, then decreased or ceased entirely for a week after his return. Barbara created a chart on graph paper, plotting transmission dates against Thomas's travel schedule over the past 9 years. The correlation was nearly perfect. Before the Seattle trip in March 1975, 4 transmissions in 2 weeks. Before the Houston trip in November 1976, 5 transmissions in 10 days. Before the Washington, D.C. trip in April 1978, 6 transmissions in 12 days. The pattern suggested preparation, coordination, delivery of intelligence before face-to-face. The meetings Thomas had described as aerospace industry consultations revealed themselves as something entirely different. The encryption pads required research. Barbara examined them under the kitchen light, noting the 5-digit number groups arranged in grids, the diagonal pencil marks indicating used sheets, the Cyrillic characters printed at the top of each page identifying the pad series. She recognized the format from books she'd cataloged on cryptography and signals intelligence, but needed confirmation. On September 5th, she went to work at the Pasadena Public Library as scheduled, maintaining her routine suspicion, and during her lunch break accessed the technical reference section. The manual she found, a declassified Army Signal Corps document titled Security Practices, detailed descriptions of one-time pad systems used by The format matched one-time pads were receiver possessed identical pads and required Barbara have come from using technical 354, which identified not any purposes. Barbara returned home at 5:45 p.m. on September 5th and began a systematic search of the house. She started with Thomas's basement office, the partitioned space she'd respected as private for 9 years. Inside were filing cabinets containing aerospace technical reports, bookshelves lined with engineering references, a desk with calculation papers and drafting. Everything appeared consistent with his claimed profession. But Barbara had learned in the past 36 hours that surfaces meant nothing. She moved the filing cabinet away from the wall, a heavy 4-drawer unit that required significant effort to shift. Behind it, at baseboard level, one brick sat slightly recessed. Barbara used a screwdriver to pry it loose. The cavity behind was approximately 12 inches deep, carved into the walls. Inside was a manila envelope sealed with tape. The envelope contained materials that confirmed her worst suspicions while simultaneously revealing depths she hadn't imagined. A Canadian passport in the name David Morrison, 68. Thomas's photograph, birthplace, a California driver's license, $8,000 in cash. Barbara said, comrade, continued with instructions for identity assumption, employment procurement at target aerospace firms, and integration into American professional communities. The final paragraph referenced marriage as a stabilization mechanism that enhanced cover credibility and reduced counterintelligence. Barbara read the letter 3 times in the small bank, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the air conditioning cold against her skin. Dmitri Volkov. The name was Russian, unmistakably Russian, and it belonged to the man she'd called Thomas for 9 years. She had been part of the plan from the beginning, selected for characteristics she could only guess at now. Isolation, professional stability, lack of family connections, perhaps a psychological vulnerability he'd identified during their first conversations in Chicago. She returned the items to the box, left the bank, and drove home in afternoon traffic that felt surreal, disconnected, as if she were moving through a world that had fundamentally changed while appearing. By the time she reached North Los Robles Avenue, Barbara understood she had one choice. She had to contact the FBI. She had to report what she'd found. And in doing so, she would destroy whatever remained of her life while confirming that none of it had been real to begin with. Thomas Holloway's flight from Seattle, United Airlines 447 at Los Angeles International. Barbara knew the exact time. Rebecca Marsh of the FBI's office. The Nagra 3 recorder was smaller than expected, approximately the size of a paperback book, secured with medical. The microphone, disguised as a button on her cardigan, could capture voices from 15 feet away. Special Agent Marsh tested the equipment twice, confirming recording quality. Her final instruction? If he becomes violent, say Milwaukee, and we'll enter immediately. Otherwise, let him talk. Barbara arrived home at 7:45 p.m. 2 FBI surveillance vehicles were positioned on North Los Robles Avenue, one 3 houses down with clear sightline, other covering. Marsh sat in the primary vehicle with headphones, monitoring the wire feed in real time. Barbara entered through the front door, turned on lights, and sat on the couch. Her hands shook. The audio transcript captured her breathing heavily, then forcing it to slow through conscious. Thomas arrived at 8:22 p.m. Barbara heard his car, the engine stopping, his door closing, his key in the lock. Footsteps in the hallway. He called her name, voice carrying casual. Barbara stood as he entered carrying a suitcase and briefcase. He smiled, started to mention the delayed flight, then stopped. His expression shifted as he registered something in her face, her posture, the tension between. Barbara spoke at 8:35 p.m. Her voice recorded, I found the cabinet. I know what's inside. Thomas was silent for 11 seconds. He set down his luggage with careful. When he looked at Barbara again, his entire demeanor had changed. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by cold calculation. He asked, voice level, what did you do with the contents? Barbara delivered the rehearsed lie. Nothing. I put everything back. I haven't told anyone. I wanted to hear it from you. Thomas believed her. 9 years of operational success bred fatal overconfidence. He had underestimated his wife throughout their marriage, assumed her incapable of deception. That assumption made him vulnerable. He sat in the armchair across from Barbara. The confession that followed was recorded in its entirety, 42 minutes of detailed admission. Thomas spoke without apparent emotion, as if delivering a briefing rather than his cover. His real name was Dmitri Volkov, born in Leningrad, March 8, 19... Recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1959 while studying at Leningrad Polytechnic. Trained by the KGB's 2nd Chief Directorate in deep cover operations, language immersion, technical intelligence collection, identity. Inserted into the United States in October 1965, using a legend built around Thomas Michael Holloway, an infant who died in Milwaukee in 1987. Dmitri studied the Holloway family history, learned Milwaukee geography, perfected a Midwestern accent, became Thomas Holloway so completely the original person. His mission was long-term. Penetration of American aerospace programs. He obtained employment at Lockheed Martin in 1966 using KGB-forged credentials. He worked into classified projects, gaining access to satellite communications technology, radar specifications, missile guidance programming. He photographed documents, memorized technical data, transmitted intelligence via shortwave to Mexico City, where Soviet handlers processed materials for Moscow Center. He selected Barbara deliberately. Instructions required establishing marital cover by 1968 to enhance stability and reduce counterintelligence. Married men with households drew less attention. He attended the Chicago conference specifically to identify candidates. Barbara met operational requirements: professional librarian, isolated, no family connections, psychologically vulnerable, desperate for... The courtship was calculated. The proposal was tactical. The marriage was operational. Barbara asked if anything had been genuine, if he had felt anything beyond operational utility. Dmitri was silent for 18 seconds. When he spoke, his answer was neither confession nor apology. He felt nothing, and she was assignment, cover component. But somewhere around 1973 or 1974, something shifted. The performance became harder because it felt less. He didn't claim love, but the loneliness had become real. The conversations had become real. The ordinary moments, meals, and accumulated into something resembling actual life. That recognition created a problem he hadn't been trained to handle. He said, the meals were real. The conversations, the loneliness. FBI agents entered at 9:17 through executing the arrest warrant. Special Agent Marsh led the entry team, weapons drawn. Dmitri Volkov did not resist. He stood with hands visible, allowed himself to be handcuffed, showed no surprise. He looked at Barbara once as agents escorted him. He said, "You were better at this than I thought." Barbara remained on the couch as the Nagra recorder continued running for 12 minutes, capturing only her breathing, quietly crying. The arrest of Dmitri Volkov became national 48 hours. The Los Angeles Times ran its spy caught in wife-led FBI to Barbara Holloway. Barbara's Angeles field office, sitting across tables from Special Agent Rebecca Marsh and rotating teams of counterintelligence specialists who took notes, recorded her statements, and asked increasingly detailed questions about 9 years of marriage to existed. They wanted everything. Thomas's daily routines, his work habits, his business trips, his phone calls, his mail handling, his social interactions, his behavioral patterns during specific time periods that corresponded to known intelligence. Barbara provided what she could, reconstructing their life together through the new lens of understanding that everything had been operational. She identified patterns she'd never questioned during the marriage, but that now revealed themselves as tradecraft. Thomas's business trips aligned precisely with classified project milestones at Lockheed, occurring immediately after new satellite specifications were finalized or radar testing protocols were established. He took phone calls in the garage, claiming better reception, when in reality he was ensuring privacy from her potential. He insisted on handling all mail personally, collecting it from the box before she arrived home, sorting through it in his basement office where she couldn't observe what correspondence he received or from whom. The FBI's damage assessment, completed in November 1978 and classified until partial declassification in 1995, concluded that Dmitri Volkov's intelligence value to the Soviet Union had been over 12 years of access to Lockheed Martin's classified aerospace programs. He had photographed and transmitted technical specifications for satellite communication systems, radar cross-section reduction methodologies, and missile guidance programming that accelerated Soviet satellite development by an. The monetary damages were assessed in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Strategic implications are enough to require immediate review of all ongoing classified projects Volkov had. Barbara's personal life assessment. On September 15, 1978, the Pasadena Public Library placed her administrative. The official explanation cited the need to evaluate whether her associated risks, though the library feared. By October 3rd, Barbara's leave became permanent. She lost her income and simultaneously fascinated. Some avoided Barbara entirely, crossing the encounter her local. Others watched her house constantly, noting when she left and returned, discussing her movements with the kind of attention normally reserved for criminals. Anonymous hate mail began arriving in early October, letters typed or written in block capitals calling her a communist sympathizer, a traitor's wife, a fool who endangered American security through her incompetence. Some letters called her a hero for exposing Dmitri. Others blamed her for not noticing sooner, suggesting willful blindness or possible. The congressional testimony occurred on October 18, 1978, before a closed session of the House Permanent Select Intelligence. Barbara sat alone at a witness table in a secure facility in Washington and answered questions from representatives who struggled to understand how an spy for 9 years without detecting the deception. The question came repeatedly, phrased in various ways but always asking, "How could you not know?" Barbara's answer, documented in classified testimony that was declassified and became the most quoted statement from the entire investigation. She said, "Because he was perfect at being someone else. And I was desperate." The FBI's investigation additional deepened Barbara's. Among Dmitri's operational files, recovered during a unit he'd made, were dossier herself. The files contained information gathered in Chicago. Her father's documented through medical records somehow her mother's documented in psychiatric following Barbara's own isolation, her psychological, California, Los Angeles. The charges were espionage under Title 18 United States Code Section 794, conspiracy to commit espionage, and false identity fraud. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorney Martin Kellerman, who had spent 3 months preparing a case built on physical evidence, surveillance recordings, and the testimony of the woman who had been married to the defendant for 9 years without knowing. Barbara attended every day of the 3-week trial. She sat in the public gallery, third row, always arriving 15 minutes before the 9 a.m. start time, and she watched Dmitri Volkov sit in a dark expression. She tried to reconcile that eaten breakfast across from her for 3,085. The prosecution methodical. Special Agent Rebecca Marsh testified about the discovery, the arrest, the contents. FBI technical experts identified the R-354 transmitter as Soviet military equipment, the encryption pads and their function. Document analyzed Lockheed materials found in the safety deposit, each containing technical for satellites of class of the logbook. Kellerman walked the Barbara's. David Rosen centered on Rosen argued that Dmitri had been trapped by KGB threats against family members in Leningrad, that he had wanted to stop but feared retribution, that his cooperation with Soviet intelligence was involuntary. Dmitri testified in his own defense on January 23rd, describing his recruitment in 1959, his training, his insertion into the United States, and claiming that by 1975 he had wanted to defect, but believed his sister and her children in the Soviet Union would be arrested if he approached him. The prosecution dismantled this defense during cross-examination by demonstrating that Dmitri had no living family, that the sister he claimed to be protecting did not exist, and that his espionage activities had continued and even intensified during the years he claimed to want freedom. The coercion defense collapsed under scrutiny. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. They returned a verdict on January 30th, 1979 at 4:47, guilty on all counts. The judge, Honor Edward Rafidi, sentenced Dmitri Volkov to 40 years in federal prison with no eligibility for 25. Barbara watched as federal marshals led him from the courtroom. He looked at her once before the door closed. His face showed no emotion she could identify. Barbara never visited Dmitri in prison. She never wrote to him. She never sought contact or closure. In March 1980, she moved to Portland, Oregon, and legally changed her name to Barbara Morrison. She found work as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the Hawthorne district, and never remarried. In September 1983, she received a letter forwarded through Dmitri's attorney. The envelope was thick, multiple pages, postmarked from the federal penitentiary in Lompoc. Barbara held it for 3 days before burning it. Whatever explanations or apologies it contained, she had decided she did not need to read. In February 1989, Barbara learned through newspaper coverage that Dmitri Volkov had been exchanged in a prisoner swap, part of a complex Cold War negotiation that sent him back to the Soviet Union after serving 10 years of his sentence. She wondered briefly if he had family there, if any part of what he'd told her had been true, then stopped herself from the answers. In 2003, after the Soviet Union's collapse and the opening of KGB archives, a Russian journalist named Yevgeny Petrov contacted Barbara while researching a cover operative. Petrov had found Dmitri's operational file, revealed that Dmitri Volkov had never married in Russia, had no entire. The American married Barbara Holloway had been his only sister. Petrov asked if Barbara wanted. She declined. Barbara Morrison died on March 14, 2018, at age 79, alone in her Portland apartment, surrounded by books. Her obituary in the Oregonian made no mention of Thomas Holloway or 1978. Among her belongings, her landlord found journals documenting 40 years of private reflection. The entries returned repeatedly to the same real. She had loved a man who never existed and spent 4 decades grieving someone. The house on North Los Robles Avenue in Pasadena. The locked cabinet, a hollow.